Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. I'm your host, Richie Billing, and in this episode, I'm flying solo for the final time in 2024. Yes, it's just me and you, dear listener, as we look back on the year and explore some of the best writing tips that I've picked up over the past 12 months. Before we dive in, I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you. Your support has been absolutely incredible this year. We hit an amazing milestone, which was 10,000 followers, which is never believed that was even possible, to be honest. So thank you very much, each and every one of you. According to Spotify, the Fantasy Writers Tour Shed has also been streamed in 70 different countries in 2024. That's pretty amazing, especially considering that most people from my country can't understand my accent. So fair play to you in the 69 other countries. It's humbling, honestly, and it blows my mind every time. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. The good news is the show will be back in January 2025 with some fantastic guests, including award winning and best selling authors. Lots to look forward to, so do stay tuned. And if you're a new listener, hit that follow or subscribe button so you don't miss anything. If you're itching for more resources beyond the podcast, you do have a Patreon page that you can check out. It's packed with goodies, writing classes on world building, one example, and there's another class on character creation. And we've got loads of resources and a complete book on writing fantasy as well. There's something for everyone, and tiers available for everyone as well. The link to find out more about that is in the description. And that is about it for the housekeeping. Time to get on with today's show. I've got loads of great stuff lined up for you. Basically, a review of the best things that I have learned about writing this year. And in particular, we're going to look at short stories, something I struggle with a lot. So I've been making a big effort to learn more about it. And I have a few more gems of wisdom from a talk by the legendary Ian Rankin, one of my favorite authors. And I share the single most important thing that I've learned this year. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, short stories. If you're like me, you might find them a bit tricky. For the longest time, I struggled to write something contained and finite in a few thousand words. Basically, my attempts often felt like the beginnings of novels instead of standalone tales. So that was always my struggle. Um, I have written a lot of short stories. Been lucky enough to get a few published, and I've just wanted to do more of it because it's something I stopped doing for a good few years, and as it turns to novels, and I really enjoy shorter fiction, and also they don't take as long to do as novels. So yeah, there's a lot to be said for a short story. But I've never been happy with what I produce. So this year I decided to tackle the challenge head on. First of all, decided to write more short stories, tried different formats, and one of the biggest sources of ideas, learning, and inspiration was a panel at FantasyCon in October, which featured a lot of brilliant short story writers and short story publishers as well. Two individuals in particular I took a lot from. They're called Dan Coxon and Andrew Hook. Between them, they've had hundreds of short stories published. And lucky for all of us, I took some notes. So these are some of the best tips that they've shared to do with writing short stories. Firstly, when you're thinking of an idea for a short story, because one of my challenges is finding that contained moment. So to help with this, they suggest focus on moments, like a character, like key moments in a character's life. And a short story doesn't have to solve every problem in that character's life. It can zero in on a small conflict or a turning point within a larger unresolved issue. So that's good to know as well. Second tip, endings don't have to be happy. It's okay if things don't go the protagonist's way. And sometimes the most impactful stories are the ones that challenge our expectations as readers. So that's something to keep in mind. This is one that I think a lot of us appreciate with short stories, and that is that you need to hook your reader immediately. And one of the best ways to do this is by dropping intriguing details early on that provoke questions within the reader. And this curiosity, the panel said, is probably one of the most powerful tools. Another tip was to leave something behind. And this is what they said makes a short story a good story and a brilliant story. And by leaving something behind, they mean that the story should stick with the reader once they've finished reading it. This could be an unforgettable predicament, such as one of Stephen King's mad ones, or it could be an open-ended conclusion that sparks a bit of thought. So things like that, where the reader is going to think about the story after they finished it and they've left the page. Now, something that they also recommended, which is something I've been experimenting with, is structure. And I'm guessing, given that they've written hundreds and hundreds of short stories, structure is definitely one that has popped up in their considerations. And they said they've had a lot of good success with it, and they're a lot of fun to play around with as well. So by structure, they mean like telling your story in a different style. So, for example, a shopping list or a series of reviews. Apparently, someone's done a series of Amazon reviews which tell a short story, or a questionnaire about a character, for example. One of the good things about these types of stories is that it encourages the reader to fill in the gaps. That prompts them to engage more with the story, to think more about what could be happening, and it can actually lead to a more satisfying read. So that is a good thing to experiment with. I've written a story recently, which is a to-do list of a goblin chieftain, which was quite an interesting one. And the way I approached that, it was over a 7 day period, and just having a series of subplots that just run through, and each day they develop mixed in with some sort of quirky day-to-day activities as well. Another fantastic tip was to describe through action. So when painting characters and telling the reader what they like and what they look like, you should show who they are through the likes of body language and behavior, not just through a visual description of their appearance. It's a tricky thing to do, but a lot of great writers do it. And I recently read a short story by Gene Wolfe, and he was describing characters like this in a fantastic way. Like, for example, I think the character in that story, she was crouching down and then she stood up. And as she stood up, the point of view character noticed these different details about her. And that was a really interesting way to convey what would otherwise be quite like forced and mundane detail. And I do have one more tip to add to this list, and this is one of my own, and it's a bit of an obvious one, and that is to read as many short stories as possible. After that panel discussion, I ended up going to the dealer's room and found an absolute mound of old short story anthologies from the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And they were all from the 80s and 90s and featured writers like Gene Wolfe, as I mentioned. And when you read these short stories, it's really important to go back and look at what the author did. Like, how did they structure something? How did they introduce the character? How did they build the suspense? How did they create the intrigue? Make notes about these things and try out the techniques yourself. And this is a tip I'm going to come back to in a little while. But yeah, it's a fantastic way to learn. So if you are looking for places to submit stories, one that consistently came up was Submission Grinder. I'd heard of it, I never really used it. So I checked it out afterwards, and it's quite a rudimentary looking tool, but it is absolutely fantastic. It's kept up to date, it's free, and you get publishers for all types of books and stories and genres and everything in between. So that's just a free online tool. Google Submission Grinder, and you'll be able to check that out. I'd also recommend checking out Duotrope, which is Duotrope. It's a paid service. It is very cheap, so it is worth paying for. You can use it to search for publishers for short stories in much the same way as Submission Grinder. Again, everything's kept up to date and fresh. I do feel like it's a little bit more user friendly than Submission Grinder. And you can also use it for novels, novellas, and literary agents as well. So doubles up, well, more than doubles up on a few different things. So I do recommend checking that out. And as a third option, you can also check out the list of short story publishers on my own website. I've updated it recently. There are about 150 publishers on there. And I also send interesting calls for submissions in my monthly newsletter for writers. So if you'd like to stay in the loop and get the lowdown on them new calls for submissions, just click the link in the description. So that's short stories. Let's take a quick break and then we'll dive into lessons from Ian Rankin. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. If you'd like to join our writing community on Discord and get access to fantasy writing classes and books on Patreon, check the links in the description. And if you don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to follow or subscribe. And to support the show, leave a quick rating on Spotify or iTunes and share this episode on social media or with anyone who you think may be interested. Thank you very much for listening. Welcome back. Let's take a look at some advice from Ian Rankin. So, if you don't know Ian Rankin, he's a best-selling crime novelist from Scotland, and he created a character called Detective Inspector John Rebus, who's a bit of a hothead, bit of a drunkard police detective, but does fit a lot of the stereotypes. But Rankin does write him very well. He's a fantastic writer. Stories are really interesting and there's a really good progression and flow to the series. And he was doing a tour not long ago to promote his new book, Midnight and Blue, where Rebus actually ends up in prison. I'm not that far ahead in the series, so I didn't engage too much with that side of it. But Rankin himself is an absolute goldmine of writing wisdom, and he's so down to earth and open about how he writes, where he finds his inspiration, and how he learns as well. So I took quite a lot away from it as a writer, and the tips that I've passed on to others, people have found them really interesting and useful as well, and they're quite broad. So the first one is to start with a theme, and this is a bit of a controversial one because theme is a difficult concept for a lot of writers. It's one I struggle with. I do not struggle with it anywhere near as much as it did because I finally managed to find a person who could explain what theme is and how it actually works within a book. And that person was Lehos Igri, and he wrote a book called The Art of Dramatic Writing. He was more of a playwright, but his grasp of storytelling was absolutely phenomenal. And his book is well worth checking out. But Igri, he, like Ian Rankin, said that theme was the starting point. It was basically the foundation of the story and the whole reason why you're writing it. And Rankin essentially suggests to begin with this and to pick something that resonates with you. It's maybe a topic that you've been pondering about or you've noticed a lot in the media. And he essentially uses that as a jumping off point to build your plot and the characters around it. He was quite keen to say that he doesn't force characters into these different types of stories. He sees what would work and who would work for the type of story that he wants to tell. So that's something to bear in mind. One of my favorite tips that Rankin shared on the night was to write what you're interested in, which is tied to the point above. Now, I do see quite a common thing in authors that they see what types of books are popular and are selling and are winning awards, and then they make a decision to pivot in that direction. Now, they may not know anything about it. For example, romantasy has been all the rage for the last few years, and if you're not into that genre, you've never read any books, you might find it very difficult to write something that pleases fans of the subgenre. So if you don't care about it, you're gonna find it a bit of a chore. Like I did an experiment this year. I wrote a story in a genre that I've never written before, but it was a popular one. And it took me months to finish because I couldn't motivate myself to do it essentially. In contrast, I wrote a novella in a few months because I was so passionate about the subject matter. And as a result, I can't wait to share it with the world. So I just powered through edits and everything. So it's enthusiasm for a subject that is so important, and you'll create something better, and that enthusiasm will shine through. And that's what readers love. Rankin also said to embrace pantsing more, even though he's a crime writer, and you think, oh, crime stories are quite intricately told, and as a result, the writer should really know everything about it. The complete opposite of that. He believes that you don't have to know every detail when you start. I mean, if he gave the example of if you're writing a closed room murder mystery, you don't even need to know how it happened at the start. And rather you can let the story unfold as you write it and you discover it and solve the crime as you're moving forward with your writing. And it can be a bit of a scary prospect to do that, especially if you decide to pursue a bit of a difficult plot. But it can be a very liberating approach as well. And you don't worry about the details. You just start writing and you figure things out as you go along. And related to this was another great tip, which is that first drafts are just for discovery. Don't get bogged down by unanswered questions or vague details. Rankin just makes notes for himself, and when he's editing, he comes back to them. He just keeps pushing until that first draft is done, and then once it's done, you can go back and fix it all. And this is quite an interesting thing that he said for me because I know a lot of people start with research first, but Rankin actually starts researching during the editing phase because he's now written the story. He then needs to know what he needs to research. And I do find this a brilliantly efficient way to write. I mean, if you read a lot of Rankin's stories, they're quite laden with like real detail that has been researched. But he said most of the time you just need to learn a few things about it and sprinkle a few details in, and that is enough to make you sound like an expert. And the main aim of this is to be economical about your research, economical about your time, and you just get on with the writing, which is the most important thing. Another nice tip was he put a lot of emphasis on speaking dialogue aloud specifically, and this is one of the best ways to ensure that it sounds natural and fits different characters, especially if you're trying accents. And the last tip, which is one I did say I was going to come back to earlier on, which was to learn by reading. And Ian Rankin has apparently never been on a creative writing class, nor has he been on any courses. He said the main way he learns is by reading other authors. And if he finds a book that he loves, he'll read it twice, once as a reader and then again as a writer. And in that second time, he dissects and works out what that writer has done to achieve that brilliance. So it's a bit like learning from short stories, just analyzing and dissecting the inner workings of the writer. And this is honestly one of the best ways to learn. Now, for my final tip of the day, and this is the biggest lesson that I've learned in 2024, and it is that you can't do it all alone. We might start off as solitary beings with our pen, paper, laptop, or whatever, but there comes a point where you hit a bit of a wall on your own, and the only way to overcome it is to get a bit of a boost so that you can climb to the other side. This is something I've known for a while. It's one of the biggest hurdles I've ran into when I first started writing, and it's why I set up our writing community. But this year, I've come to appreciate its true value and meaning. There have been plenty of tough moments in 2024 where I felt like giving up, but I decided to make changes. I reached out to people and tried my best to build a team and a network of support. And then I've gone at it again, and this time I'm feeling a lot better about things. Spoken to and met so many different writers over the past year who have told me how much they've benefited from working with other writers as well. Be it beta reading, critique groups, open writing platforms where you can share your stories and get feedback, and even just chatting with like-minded people. Some people they live isolated lives, they live in remote places, they might not speak to people very often. And community is so important, especially when you can connect over things that you love. Taking meaningful steps forward as a writer often requires the help of others, whether it's feedback from fellow writers, collaboration with editors and artists, or simply being part of a supportive community. The key is to engage with people who can help you grow. And it's this growth that's vital. Growth in our confidence, growth in our abilities, growth in our understanding of the craft. With all of these combining together, there's literally nothing to stop you from achieving your hopes and dreams. So if you're listening to this and you want to become part of a community of writers that can help and support you grow, just click the link in the description. There's 600 of us now. There's dozens of people meeting every week in small critique groups. There's even more people swapping stories, discussing ideas in the different threads that we have. So if you're looking for your own people, click the link in the description. Come and say hello. And that is a wrap for this episode and for 2024 as well. Thank you again for being part of this incredible journey. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a fellow writer. And as always, check out our Patreon page if you want to dive deeper into the craft of fantasy writing. Here's to a fantastic year ahead. Keep on scribbling, keep on dreaming, and I'll see you in 2025.